I'm excited to introduce Bridget Cromhout, who is our main speaker today, who will be giving us the talk about Cloudy with a Chance of DevOps. Wanted to also mention before you get up here that she's originally started at the U. Of course, we all know all great IT professionals start at the U. She was over in CSE as a student worker. She then moved over to MSI. I don't know, were you anywhere else or? Okay. Okay.
Now MSI and CS. It was a CS department.
That's right. Not CSE, it was CS, just CS. Now she's a principal technologist at Cloud Foundry at Pivotal. She's very active in the local DevOps communities. She arranges tech meetups. She's also an organizer of DevOps Days at Minneapolis. And if you're not going, you should go. Tickets are still available until July 13th. I know I'm going. I know there are other fabulous people on campus that are going. You should go too. She's also on the program committee for Velocity. Please help me give a warm welcome to Bridget Cromhout.
Thank you, Debbie. And thank you, everyone. I'm really glad everyone's here. I see a lot of familiar faces. I guess this is the, like you said, you start at the U and you're a student worker, and it's the go-go 90s, and giving root to a bunch of undergraduates seems like a good idea at the time, right? And hey, you lived to tell the tale. It turned out all right. So yeah, I do live here. Well, theoretically. I mean, I have a spouse and a condo and 2 cats, and I'm on the road like 85% of the time. But, as Debbie mentioned, I work at Pivotal. Some of you may be familiar with the podcast I co-host, Arrested DevOps, which is kind of fun stuff. And I am part of the shadowy global cabal that organizes DevOps Days. I actually run a global committee, so Minneapolis is my home DevOps Days. So in my opinion, I do have a favorite, and it is that one. And yeah, it's July 20th and 21st. So I know Samantha and Jeff sitting here are on our committee, so you can chat with them if you want to find out more about it, and they can, help you get signed up with tickets or whatever. So we're really close to sold out, aren't we? It's like, we maybe have 50 tickets left, but other than that. So yeah, so as Debbie was saying, I got my start getting my CS degree in the 90s. And I feel like if you did as well, these books look very, very familiar. And I'm going to just warn you right now that because I started programming in Scheme, I have an awful lot of cars and cars in the way I think. So there's going to be a lot of digressions in here, so just buckle up. Imagine the parentheses, nesting and cascading. Oh yeah, and those books are sitting on the a memory board from a Convex C1. See if anybody remembers sunrace.solar.umn.edu. Yeah, I have the front panel and a memory board from that in my house. Because that's the machine I learned to play NetHack on in the ACM student office. And then remember the day we disassembled it? It's like, yeah. it was some good times. So if you're listening to that and you're thinking like, the 90s sounded really fun. It's like, well, you know what? There's actually a lot of fun now too. And what I think is probably the part that was the most surprising to me about getting into this whole DevOps thing is I felt like, you know what, been there, done that. I'd been in computing for a while. I pretty much knew the score, but I didn't really. It's like the world just keeps changing around you. And that's one thing. I was at the U from 94 to 99, and then I came back and worked for MSI from 2005 to 2012. And I got to say, when I went out in industry in 2012, because that's what we called it, was like industry. It was this, place that wasn't academia. And yeah, I left at a middle management job at MSI and went to go be a one-woman ops team at a startup. And that was a completely different world. And so it's kind of like, yeah, it's nice to think about what was, but things do keep changing. One thing that I definitely built a lot of who I felt like I was, my identity around being a Unix person. And yeah, by the way, if you've never used the regex crossword site, super fun. It's like regular expression crosswords, good to put yourself to sleep at night. Very relaxing. But I definitely built up this whole identity of I'm a Unix person. This is who I am. This is what I do. I actually went and I a couple of startups later, I was running Docker in production, as one does, in October 2013, when the main thing on Docker's website says, like, under no circumstances should you run this in production. And we're like, YOLO. I actually joined that company in June 2014, mostly because I was like, I'm not afraid of things. This sounds fun. And like what I learned from, like, you know, Dockering all the Dockers at the startups and what have you is that all of those tools are interesting and fun and definitely make life easier, don't get me wrong. They don't actually change or even really fix a lot of the things that we're trying to do in tech. Like, whoops, sorry. Like the talk track of a talk I've given at a couple of conferences this year is called, like, Containers Will Not Fix Your Broken Culture and Their Hard Truths. It's like, sorry. But that said, yeah, I was doing the whole hashtag ops life thing. And then talked to a friend who was like, you should join me on the dark side in marketing at my software vendor. And I was like, vendors are evil, marketing is evil. I'm pretty sure I don't want to be evil, but I did because it seemed really fun, actually. This is the thing, it's like, I thought that it would completely, you know, destroy who I am as a techie if I didn't have Red on production anymore. But you know what? It didn't. And I gotta tell you though, like, if you delete the PagerDuty app, but instead you spend all your time in the Fly Delta app, your sleep will be just as bad. Just putting that out there. Like, it doesn't actually solve that. But let's talk about, like, what we're trying to accomplish with this DevOps stuff. Does anyone recognize this quote, or can anybody give me a guess as to approximately when is this last week that they're talking about? 67 deploys, 496 changes, 18 people. Does this sound familiar? Does anybody have an idea of, like, when this would have been what people are excited about? Last week, last month, 2 years ago? Shut it up, come on. What do you think? This is the academic setting. People don't want to have the wrong answer, and you are very close to right, sir. This was actually on the Flickr dev blog in 2008. So there was a talk that some people think started off, like, you know, a lot of the DevOps movement, called the 10 plus deploys a day at Flickr, that John Allspaw, who's now CTO at Etsy, and Paul Hammond gave that talk at Velocity in 2009. And a lot of organizations that I talk to today, I mean, now that I'm, you know, one of those evil marketing people with opinions on Bash, and I, like, go in as part of field enablement exercises and, like, meet with customers, and I'm talking to organizations that are like, this week, I met with an organization that was like, this year, our goal is to add Git and Jenkins and Puppet. And I was like, it's 2016. You got to start sometime. I'm like, I'm glad you're doing this because it's better than not doing it. But, like, that's what kind of made me realize, you know, like what they say about the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. Like, okay, it's not. I mean, a lot of people do not have the GitHub Enterprise that you have on campus right now. They don't have it at their companies today. They wish they did. And it's like, so we're all in different places on this journey, figuring this out. And, like, looking at how somebody else is DevOpsing and saying, like, why haven't we DevOpsed as much as them? It's kind of a useless exercise. Because it's like, you're, like Debbie is saying, you're on a journey to get the stuff done that you're trying to get done for your goals. And a lot of places, when they're thinking about why do they want this stuff, I mean, probably they don't want it just because it's a trendy buzzword or whatever. And a lot of places that can't do, you know, 10 deploys a day like today, they also don't have the chef stuff that you have now. And I see John Boggs sitting over there. I bet you had a lot to do with getting this, the RHEL chef stuff going, right? A little bit, yeah. And a lot of people, when they want a new VM, they do have to have it artisanally hand whittled and don't have, like, the ability to make one that's exactly like the previous one, which, again, once you start moving down the path that you're on, so much better, so much less stressful too, right? Because then if something gets screwed up, you know you can get back to the way things were because you have a cookbook that will actually produce it. Another thing is, like, when you're trying to put changes out, I know that when I was at MSI even, we would have maintenance windows where we would make a whole bunch of changes, and then we would just kind of hope that things would go well, and we would hope that we wouldn't have to try to back out of it, because, like, putting changes onto your live systems is kind of fraught with, and Sammy and Irene are smiling because, like, in the network world, you're like, how many times did you end up needing to drive into campus because you rebooted something without having hit right, you know? Exactly. And like getting the ability to move faster and more accurately on this stuff is huge. You know, as Debbie was saying, like for productivity. And then I think there's another piece that a lot of orgs maybe don't have the introspection to focus on, and I suspect possibly the university does, which is like when something goes wrong, which it will because computers, I mean, they're basically terrible, right? We know this. So like when something goes wrong, how do we recover from that? You know, and if we do it with like, you know, finger pointing and blame, like that's probably going to make people out of sheer self-defense not tell you what actually happened, which makes it a lot harder to debug. So it's like a lot of orgs are trying to work through how to get better in all these areas. And none of these, you'll notice, none of these are a specific tool. Like none of these are, well, we chose Puppet. Well, you're using Chef. And it's like, no. I mean, that's not what people are really focused on. They're focused on this kind of thing. They, again, like, when you look at a Rube Goldberg machine like this, I've looked at this picture a bunch of times. I've used it in a bunch of talks. I've been still trying to figure out what he's trying to do. Like, what do we think? Like, maybe use the napkin? Because that's what he's trying to do. I feel like I've written these chef cookbooks for like the one thing that I wanted to accomplish. I ended up like trying to accomplish through you know, Rube Goldberg series of like indirection to the point where, yes, I built something automated, but there was probably a cleaner, easier way to get that done. And I think that's kind of the trap is if we set a goal of automating absolutely every single thing we're doing manually currently, the exact same way we're doing it currently, only automatically. Imagine all of the corner cases that you're trying to build in logic for the things that go wrong that you know how to, oh, wait, we got to build something in for that. And it's like, so that, even though automation is super valuable, that's, I think, a trap that a lot of people fall into when they start automating things, is like trying to come up with an automated way to do everything the way they're doing it now. And like the goal is not to automate things, right? Like the goal is to go, we have value faster. People have what they need faster. You know, a faculty member has a new idea and can actually implement what they want to do faster. And I think that that's like a really useful and important metric to think about is like, is this actually adding value? I mean, if the thing that I'm trying to do is super fun, but maybe doesn't make any difference to anyone's life but mine, maybe that's a side project that I should play with on the weekend. You're laughing because you're like, yeah, I've totally done that. And so like, I think that's one of those, you know, DevOps problems that I've definitely fallen into, and I know that a lot of other people do too. Okay, so like, also, by the way, like the word DevOps is kind of ludicrous, right? So I think that honestly, the reason that like for example, Patrick Dubois, who started DevOps Days in 2009, said that he called it that because Agile Systems Administration was too long for a conference name. Like that's the only reason. So like it's this clipped compound or, you know, portmanteau or whatever you want to call it. But it's I think a lot of people start focusing on like trying to turn it into a religion or trying to turn it into something like super strict with like checklists and processes. And I'm like, oh, I tell so much sadness. Please don't implement sadness as a service. Like, don't do this. Because that's the thing, right? Is like you're not going to be able to come up with a list and have that be, you know, all of the things. This is Schaefer, who is arguably the first person to tweet the word DevOps like on Twitter in 2009, and he is my boss at Pivotal. Actually, he's the one who convinced me to cut to the marketing dark side. Does kind of mock like all of these buzzwords, right? So like whatever it is that we want to talk about, like we're just trying to be more effective. We're trying to accomplish the stuff better, all the stuff that we're trying to accomplish, all our goals. And I think that one of the places that, and this is Damon Edwards' like classic wall of confusion. One of the places that I know I definitely put this wall up, like when before I tried the, you know, total immersion therapy of, I'm the only ops person here, so I better cooperate with the dev people. But before I did that, you know, I definitely had like the ops people and the dev people, and then there would like be the dev people who worked on my team, so they were okay. But then there would be those other dev people, and I just assumed that like, I really assumed this, right? Like I assumed that they wanted to YOLO shit out into production, and I didn't want them to, and I had to protect production from them like at all costs. And it leads to this really negative way of interacting with your coworkers that I'm certain that everyone since then has solved, right? Like nobody has that anymore. But I think that one of the things that can cause this is setting up disparate incentives. So if one team's incentives are all set around whether or not they ship new features, and another team's incentives are all set around MTTRs and SLAs and a whole bunch of other acronyms, then like if you're worried that those new features are going to do terrible things to your MTTRs, then you're going to have to go to a really boring meeting, and you would much rather go to like something that ends in happy hour. You're going to probably be against them doing whatever it is that they want to do because it sounds terrible. And also the last N times they did it, it was terrible. I feel like that's the sort of thing that we need to try as IT people, that we need to try to get past by lining up people's incentives so that whether or not it stayed up, whether or not you ship new features, did anyone get any useful work done? Like, did the researchers who were trying to research actually get any results? Or did everything go down just in time for them to not get their grant done? Like, that's the kind of stuff that is measurable from the point of view of everyone. Like, what did the end result end up being? And by the way, like, I'm sure some of you recognize where this is. I feel like in the Twin Cities, we have like, it's like the land of 10,000 DevOps cliches, right? Like, this is not photoshopped. I mean, except for like the word DevOps, that container, the shipping container is not actually full of like 18 units of DevOps. But if you look at like, cloud and containers and silos and like the slow burning tire fire that is proud is somewhere there behind my Twitter handle. That's like the stuff that everybody focuses on kind of in isolation, right? Like, well, we have cloud that we need to think about, and maybe we should build some private cloud, and maybe we have to hybrid the private cloud with our public cloud, because we definitely have to have some kind of public cloud. So let's give everybody AWS credits because we know they're using it anyway. And it's like, that's the kind of stuff that I think it's really easy as IT people to end up just thinking into that level of detail and spending all your time fighting those particular fires. And that's sort of the direction. Like, yes, this stuff is all useful to think about, but I think it's really even more useful to think about, the human level of stuff. So like, when you think about, for example, what in technology are you excited about? What in technology do you want to use? A lot of it ends up being, well, what are people talking about? I mean, you work at a university, they're probably not going to let you, run a archive bot against the front page of Hacker News and implement all of that next week, like probably. But there's a lot of stuff that, you've seen these cycles, especially if you've been at the U for a while, you've seen these cycles come and go, and people get really excited about something, and then they're not really excited about it, and then it's just normal and everyone's using it, and then you're wondering why anyone cared, or maybe you just forget about it and never use it again. And I feel like when people are listening to something about DevOps, sometimes they think, and you all came to this on purpose, presumably, nobody made you show up, so maybe you're not thinking, this is going to be gone in another year. I think I would submit to you that it's probably not going away, just because having more effective IT practices and getting faster results is generally something people like. So the exact tools are definitely going to keep changing, but hey, let's concept work together cooperatively in order to get things done faster, better, cheaper, et cetera, probably sticking around. And like, that doesn't mean that you have to, again, be using absolutely all of the things TM. Like, I don't know, are microservices something that the university is really into? I don't even know. Like, you're like, no, we like macroservices. We like our monolith. But it's like, hey, we like our monolith, we call it PeopleSoft. I don't know. But it's like a couple of jobs ago, I was working at a startup, a streaming video startup, that the Drama Fever one, where we were running Docker in production, and it was much like Netflix, if Netflix were like much smaller and mostly Korean soap opera. What we were doing, of course, because it was 2014, and any Python shop that starts business in 2009 is obviously a Django shop. But then like by mid-2013, you're trying to rewrite everything into Go and like implement microservices, because this is just how tech trends go. And what we discovered when we started breaking everything out into microservices is that like that whole concept of two pizza teams, which by the way, like you're thinking, well, I mean, we have teams of a reasonable size, whatever a reasonable size might be. But then you hear about, Amazon breaking everyone up into two pizza teams, and you're immediately thinking, well, okay, like how hungry are those people? And like how large are the pizzas? And this makes no sense at all, right? And I think that like the idea of making your team size, small enough for manageable, units of work has value, but is also not strictly speaking necessary, depending on what the communication is like between the groups, between the teams. And that doesn't mean you need a giant matrix style organization where you have like 8 different bosses who are all going to complain about your TPS report cover sheets. That is something that the university I know has done from time to time. And that doesn't actually work super well in industry. I'm just guessing it probably doesn't work super well in the university either. But when you break things up into a whole bunch of small teams, you also might end up breaking things up into a whole bunch of small services, which, by the way, service-oriented architecture, the enterprise service bus, this stuff isn't even new. But when you look at microservices, the idea, theoretically, is supposed to be independent deployability, make it easier to have completely disparate groups work on them. But the problem is that you end up with troubleshooting. I mean, you better have pretty good monitoring and telemetry to see where exactly the errors have crept in. If things are going to be changing on a whole bunch of axes everywhere in your organization, this is the problem with decentralization, is it becomes a lot harder to figure out what's going on. So that's an important point to remember, because I think that we have this trend right now towards, decentralize all the things, which is good for many purposes, but then you need to have better oversight, telemetry, some idea, the giant octopus of OIT kind of want to get its tendrils in there to figure out what's going on. And this kind of brings us to the Conway's Law. I mean, I feel like it's a DevOps cliche by now, so maybe it's something that you all are, very, very familiar with. If you're not, the general idea is that organizations will produce systems that are copies of the communication structure of the organization. A lot of people leave the word communication out, and they just say, well, that's why we need to reorg to match the new way we're doing software. And it's well, you leave out the most important word. And so as long as you have good communication between the teams, you don't necessarily need to reorg to match whatever the software pattern of the week is, which again, is going to keep changing. And especially if people work at large institutions where, again, I see faces that were here when I got here in the 90s. It's possible that they don't really like reorgs, because if they like reorgs, they'd probably be working at tiny startups. So, that's something to keep in mind, is that the communication inside and between teams is a really important piece of this. At this point, I'm going to kind of put a plug in for my friends Jennifer and Catherine just published the Effective DevOps book. It came out a pre-release, it's in actual print, I think. Now, I haven't seen the print one yet, but I think it was last week or the week before that it came out. And this book has absolutely no tool-related detail whatsoever, even though Jennifer actually works for Chef. Catherine works at Etsy, which, is well known for being DevOps poster children. But it's just talking about how we use tools to make sure that people can still work with these systems. Because, and here, this is for the academics in the crowd, I'll do the obligatory refer to a paper. Woods et al. Wrote the Common Ground paper, 2004, which is, and you can tell I've been podcasting too much when I want to say I'll put a link in the show notes. There will not be show notes, but I will put these slides online afterwards, and I will put a link to the Common Ground paper, which you could probably Google up. And the valuable thing there is this idea of coordination surprise. If you and your coworker are on the same page and you understand where each other are, and then at some point something happens and you're like, why did you do that? I thought you were late. And it's at some point, your understanding of where each other were diverged. And a lot of us get caught unawares by that, and that can lead to a lot of conflict inside organizations. So that's one of those places where if you check in with each other more frequently, that's less likely to happen. And we have an academic paper that says so. Something else, I think it was actually John Alspaugh from Etsy, the same person who emailed or he tweeted about this PDF, because he really likes to email you PDFs. It's his favorite method of communicating. Sammy's laughing, she knows Alspaugh. So he also was talking about this book about nonviolent communication. And of course, I was just this is directed at me, and I mean, I don't communicate violently. Of course, then I'm thinking stabity, 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 so like probably I do. But it's actually really interesting to think about like both nonviolent communication and emotional literacy, which you're immediately thinking, why am I hearing about touchy-feely kumbaya nonsense? This is supposed to be a talk about DevOps. And I'm like, aha, but it is. Because even if you don't really care about the touchy-feely kumbaya, you probably want the things that you ask for to happen. And I mean, most of us want the things we ask for to happen. And one thing that nonviolent communication recommends is when you hear someone say something, repeat it back to them. So what I'm hearing is that I should repeat back what you say. Why that's useful as a technique, besides making people very happy because they like hearing their own ideas, why that's really useful is it's kind of like using TCP instead of UDP. Like if you have an ACK, if you have a SYN-ACK, if you have that handshake that says that you all actually heard each other and agree, it's a lot more likely that everybody's going to be on the same page, and you're at least not less likely to get the things that you want. So as opposed to the part where there's, you know, you've all been in these meetings. I know I probably led a lot of these meetings. You sit in the meeting for the designated hour. At the end of, there were no notes. At the end of the meeting, everyone leaves, and then they all go do what they want. And then they're all very angry next week. It's like rinse, repeat. And so the part where you repeat back to the other person, and maybe put something in writing, as to what you all believe you heard is super useful. And this is Ambassador Kosh. We gotta have our 90s shout out here. And he's a Vorlon. They're known for being mysterious. And what he said was understanding is a three-edged sword, and he didn't really explain it more than that. But then Sheridan later says, a Vorlon once told me, understanding is a three-edged sword. Your side, their side, the truth. And it's like, that's one of those things I try to remember. And I got a lot of practice with this when I was, you know, in middle management at the university. And what I try to remember is that everybody is the protagonist of their own narrative. And like, I'm at best a walk-on bit player for most of you. And, you know, and I made my cameo and then I'm gone. But your narrative continues, and all the things you need and want in it continue. And you just don't understand why your coworker doesn't see things your way. And you're like, oh, wait, except they see things their way. And so trying to understand why they want the completely wrong things that they want is a really useful way to get them to instead see things your way, or at least mitigate some of the damage caused by them wanting things that are totally wrong. And this takes us to JavaScript. Okay, so it's, what is it, Wednesday? It's Wednesday, right? Okay, so it might be a little bit too early for the latest JavaScript framework of the week to come out, but I'm assuming it'll be here by tomorrow. And there's like, I feel like there's a plethora of tech choices out there. And and those of us who work in central services are saying like, at this point, that's why we try to limit their choices. But there's a plethora of choices out there, and there is that delicate balance between letting people bike shed endlessly, which if you're not familiar with that one, it's the whole like, you know, let's have a long meeting where the only thing that gets accomplished is you argue about what color to paint the bike shed. I forget what you were actually supposed to accomplish, but you definitely want it to be green, you know. And like, so giving people a plethora of choices does sometimes feel incredibly dangerous or like counterproductive. But at the same time, people want what they want. And so the stuff that you're doing where you're like, well, and you can install your own packages. YOLO, it's like at your own risk, but like that is a really delicate balance to walk, but it's one that the more that you open that up, the less work you put on yourself, which is super useful. You know, again, ops person, from the ops point of view. Something else to think about too, like while we're talking about communication, is I feel like we've spent a lot of time in, you know, IT developing a reasonable level of understanding about failure states in our systems. Like we understand that if our databases, you know, end up in split brain mode, this is going to be a problem. We maybe are not going to want to write, or we're going to want to make sure to flag those writes or whatever. And we don't necessarily spend as much time thinking about how that exact same thing, the misconnection, by the way, if you're not familiar with Kyle Kingsbury, he has a wonderful Twitter account, and he's also written this really interesting open source tool called Jepson, which, and he recently moved to Chicago, so like Midwest, but because, you know, San Francisco is totally over. But he wrote this really interesting tool that basically injects failure into distributed systems so that you can see how they actually perform when bad things happen, like, you know, network partitions and that sort of thing. And that makes me think of, like, Eric Brewer came up with CAP theorem and then wrote about it like 12 years later, saying that, okay, so if you're kind of saying consistency, availability, partition tolerance, like pick two, I mean, and as Katie McCaffrey from Twitter, she does like distributed systems at Twitter, likes to say, you don't get to pick not having partition tolerance because there's going to be partitions because physics and math. So like you have to have partitions happen. So you basically just have to choose between like, do you want to favor consistency? That's not a word. Do you want to favor consistency or do you want to favor availability? And when you're thinking of that in terms of humans, Eric Brewer kind of said like a partition is a time-bound in communication. Is what he said. He wrote an article for InfoQ a couple of years ago. I could put a link to that somewhere, probably, maybe. But what he's meaning by that is, imagine that you have a network partition. Presumably, it's not going to stay separated until the heat death of the universe, or maybe it will, at which point you won't care anymore. But like at some point, it'll come back together or not. But you basically consider it a partition as long as you're waiting for it. And if you think of that in terms of humans, how many times have you had the meeting that you have at the time and been there for the requisite 55 minutes and not actually accomplished anything because the person who needed to make a decision was not there? I'm like, that is a thing that happens. But if you're allowing that person not being available to prevent you from being able to move forward, then you basically have like a block, you know, in your ability to make distributed decisions. So like this is another one of those things where we've spent a lot of time on the algorithms to try to make this sort of thing work well so that you can update Facebook even if, like, you know, your Facebook looks different from someone else's because it's Tuesday and they rolled out a change, and like maybe you're both talking to like completely different data stores that are kind of synchronizing on the back end, and we don't even know and we don't care. And like we don't spend as much time thinking about that on the human level. And the ability to, you know, continue to operate when somebody else is in the boundary waters is like super useful, but we don't focus on it. Something else that I feel like is, you know, underappreciated in tech is the part where you do exactly what you're doing now, like sit down at a round table, grab a time, like, you know, communicate with each other like directly, and not through the forums that you've set up for yourself where you're like, and then we have the committee meeting about this. I'm like, that's probably good. Like the committee meeting is probably useful, but if you're the kind of person I am, where there would be people, I'd occasionally have conflict with, and I would try to avoid interacting with them except in the ways that I had to. That was kind of counterproductive. The people that I would choose to have you know, unstructured interactions with, I tended to have better, you know, communication with. So that's something that I can do better on for sure. But something else too, I think that's definitely appropriate to the university world, which is that, like, sometimes it feels like there's this giant burden of things you have to keep supporting forever because somebody wanted them once. And because, right? All right, so you gotta tell me true, does the electrical engineering, like, machine room still have that line printer thing that, like, prints out the console? Is it? Excellent. Excellent. So at least some things didn't stay forever. But I just remember, like, being all, why is it printing the console onto fine-fold paper, and how many years of wow? And that's the kind of thing that you think, like, there probably was a good reason at one point. I mean, it's like, oh, I can tell you stories. It's probably some faculty member wanted it, but there's probably a good reason at some point why things that seem super, super antiquated still existed. And I think that that's not entirely a terrible thing because, again, what is the goal? Like, if we're trying to facilitate people's work, if we're trying to facilitate their research, the fact that their grad student left and all they have is some Fortran that the grad student wrote that they really do need F77 to keep running, like, maybe that is important. Like, maybe they're going to actually get that grant and, you know, like, go to Maui or whatever if they get that. I was in Bangalore this year, and I saw an IBM 1401, which is sort of interesting to me because I was excited because I had already prepped this presentation, and I'm using a font, which if the font looks somewhat familiar, it's because it's the IBM 1403 font. My friend Jeff Cohen made a font, and but I had never seen a 1403 printer, and I had never seen a 1401. I saw them in this museum, and the most entertaining part was the sign that explained that the Postal Service in Bangalore was using these 1401s to generate money orders until 1989, when they moved that off of the mainframe and then immediately sent it to the museum. And I was like, you know what? That's actually, to me, that's a success story, because you notice it wasn't that they shut down absolutely everything in 1989. They had slowly, over time, migrated everything off of that old system. And that's kind of the strangler pattern, which again, that's in nonviolent communication, sounds sort of what? But the idea of when you say you want to break down your monolith and migrate to, or maybe just get everything off of the Z series or whatever, when you're trying to do that, you can't do it all at once, because we've all seen the big bang, second system thing fail horribly, because, you spend 2 years building the replacement, only it doesn't actually work, and it's not actually what you actually wanted, and the migration goes terribly. And so the fact that these folks migrated presumably one thing at a time off until there was just one more thing, then finally migrated that, then sent it right to the museum, it kind of says I think this is the way that we do want to move off of legacy technology, is get the value we need to get off of it until we can get the value from something else. Presumably they did not stop using money orders in 1989. On the other hand, we're gonna go back to the well of DevOps cliches and talk about Deming for a second. And yes, if you're wondering, yes, I totally took this picture in Minneapolis in April, because but it was a couple Aprils ago. But I feel like sometimes there's this, we don't want to change because it kind of smacks of effort, and maybe if we ignore it long enough, it'll go away. And yeah, it's true. If you ignore the one new thing that they're trying to make you do long enough, maybe that'll go away. Ignore Docker long enough, and maybe you have to care about unikernels instead. Awesome. So there is a possibility of that. But in general, change is coming for all of us. So if we don't want to be the sad snowman in the gutter, we probably do have to pay attention to it at some point. Or as Deming says, it's not necessary to change because survival is not mandatory. All right, so we gotta wrap this up because we all want to go to happy hour. So let's talk about what are the actual actionable things I want you to think about as you leave. Not Kubernetes, even though the wheel just kind of calls out to that. But yeah. Maybe you're not thinking about containers. Maybe you're not thinking about scheduling and orchestrating your containers. That's okay. But you probably do want to think about the fact that choosing to do nothing is still a choice, because the world's going to keep changing around you. Last summer, my partner Joe and I used a really exciting gardening practice called benevolent neglect. It worked really well, as you can see. This is 2 weeks of a harvest. The problem is, though, if you take a look at those giant yellow monsters, those are patty pan squash. They would have been delicious if they were the same size as those rather large heirloom tomatoes. And they weren't. They were really, really, really big and full of seeds and kind of, woody and inedible. And so the fact that we did nothing did not actually make things better in that particular case. On the other hand, the fact that we did nothing for the tomatoes made them amazing. But it's choosing to do nothing is still a choice, is basically what I want everybody to remember, because there will be factors that are not your choices that are going to, make some things happen or not happen for you. One other thing is the idea of we've always done it that way, or that in very important item number 42 on the checklist needs to be there forever. It makes me think of, this was in a hotel in Amsterdam last fall for Velocity EU. All of the bathrooms had this sticker. If you can't read it, it says, "We kindly request you to take your shower in the bathtub." I'm okay, so something happened in this hotel to the point where they printed up stickers and they put them in every bathroom, because everyone's tweeting out pictures going do you have this sticker in your bathroom? Here's the funny part. The shower head in the bathtub did not look like it was possible to do that. So then I was starting to think when did they put these stickers in here? And did they then remodel and just not take them down? And I feel we all have things in our run books, in our playbooks, that are like that. And then you start, when you're onboarding new people, you just tell them oh, but this thing we don't actually do, but we do this thing. And but you didn't update. Well, because the rules say this is the process we got certified is what we actually do. It's like, I think that's the problem with having like super rigid processes is you had a reason every time you added something. I mean, how many people like have a monitoring system that they have a check? They kind of have like the PTSD from like every single check. So they're like, oh, I added that check after that outage. I added that check after that exploded. But it's like, oh, you're checking something that doesn't actually exist anymore. So, all right. So, and I think that the other thing that you've got to have, I mean, every presentation has to have an adorable kitten, right? And the other thing to remember is that like, there's so much ridiculousness going on in tech that when you kind of think, I mean, obviously, like, you know, Attack Kitten there is now an expert at, I think, Docker and Logstash based on what he's like getting through osmosis. But I think that if you're having people throw all sorts of trendy buzzwords at you and they're telling you that your apps have to be 12-factor, and you're like, please stop saying apps, we're not using mobile phones. And like there's all sorts of stuff that feels like maybe it's just too much. Like it is actually okay to not take absolutely every single thing that exists and roll it out into production next week or last week. Like that's me absolving you of the guilt of not having like Dockered all the Dockers immediately. You don't have to. It is actually okay. Like I didn't touch public cloud until 2012, which by the way, like in 2012, when I went and interviewed at the startup and my first interview, I was like, yeah, I've never actually used AWS ever. And then I went home and got the free tier and tried it. So at least I could go back to my second interview and be like, so yeah, I did try it. And I felt like I was so behind and I was never going to catch up. And like, wow, it's 2016 now, and that feels like a really, really long time ago. So like, I think that's important is like, even if you feel like, you know, hey, we've been focused heads down in this one specific area, and what about all these other things? Like, it is actually okay if you don't do all the things. Like, that's probably fine. Again, back to what's going to bring value to your organization. Because let's talk about that wall of confusion, right? Like, it was a cute little brick wall. You could almost like look over it with your tippy toes. Like, that's not what it really looks like, right? Like, when there's barriers inside your organization, it's more like this. Do you remember when the Great Lakes were like pretty much frozen a couple of years ago? You would go up and check out like the ice caves. This is that's Joe, my spouse, standing there, just kind of looking at the wall, being like, "Whoa." So I'm taking the picture standing like out on Lake Superior, and this is, I think, what the barriers between our groups and between departments and the various fiefdoms everyone has carved out for themselves. That is, I mean, we've heard the old joke, right? Like, why are academic politics so bitter? Because the stakes are so low. And the people I went to war with because I wanted my employees to have the office at the window, it's just like, ugh. But like when you think about like the barriers between people, I would submit like trying to charge at that wall or climb that wall or dig your way through that wall is probably not going to work, like ever. But just looking for the humans in the picture, looking for where you can just change the rules, give yourself permission to do something different, walk around the barriers that you can probably ignore most of them. Let's be real, like, you can probably choose that. So making that choice, I think, is a really good way to go. And that's basically it. Like this whole, like Debbie was saying, this whole DevOps journey that we're on, no one ever gets there. No one ever like has DevOps all the DevOps and then they're done and they've totally succeeded at DevOpsing or whatever. I mean, if you come to DevOps Days Minneapolis, you'll hear from a lot of people who are talking about where they are on their journeys. And maybe they feel like they've accomplished some stuff that they're ready to talk about, but they're probably there to share their vulnerability with you and tell you that they don't have it all figured out either, but they're willing to learn and listen and share. And like that's kind of, I think all of you who are interested in this, like you're in a really good place because you're with a whole bunch of people in your community who are all willing to learn and listen and share with you. So that's pretty much it. That's my pitch. Be excellent to one another, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think we probably have 5 minutes for questions before, if people have any, or we could just talk over beer. That also works. So, all right.
Questions? When it comes to choices, right here.
I think the overhead mics are on, so we don't need that.
Okay.
Ignore that. Overhead mics are on now, so.
When it comes to choices, could you just name one of your big mistakes, and then how, and I just want that to so we can really, and then how do you know how to cut them up quick?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you about something that I made a terrible decision on at the university. So I was managing a group. You know what story I'm going to tell. I was managing a group, and there were developers who reported to another person who I didn't even dislike that person. I just kind of thought these developers wanted to get a little shit out into production and didn't really trust them. But this developer really wanted the ability to customize their own builds and to just, you know, do things like install a Git client. I was like, why do you need that? Or like, they wanted the ability to interact with production and said that they would join my on-call rotation. If I let them in, they would actually join on-call. Our on-call at MSI at the time, we didn't actually have our servers bother us so much, but because somebody made the exciting life choice of having a data center in a 100-year-old building, we had a lot of environmental issues take us personally. And so like that was a pretty big offer for this developer to be saying, I'll join in that suffering if I can just join in some of the benefits. I said, no, I won't consider that. And look, I ran into that guy at Minibar a couple of years later, and I apologized to him. I was like, I was so wrong. Why wasn't I willing to listen to you and trust that you weren't my enemy and you didn't have any nefarious plans, and you wanted to share the burden and the pain as, you know, as a route to also sharing some of the assets. And I would say that was a big mistake I made, was going with, you know, strict reporting structure to delineate who would be able to have access to something. Because you don't need to be the high priest for the box, like that's not necessary. And that was an attitude that I had that was probably one that I should have let go of a long time before. And I really didn't until I went to go work in a place that everybody was developers except me. So I learned pretty quick that I was like, thank you for giving me on conversation with me, Des. I can sleep sometimes. I'm sorry, I told a whole long story, and I think I lost track of the second half of your question.
No, just how do you know how to cut when you're making one of those mistakes, or receive the input from other people about mistakes?
I mean, I think that at the time, the people who were telling me that this would be a good idea to include this developer in our on-call rotation, I wasn't willing to listen to them because I felt a lot of probably fear and also uncertainty and doubt, all those things, all the fun about letting go a little bit. So I think maybe anytime you kind of feel like you're trying to cling to things a little closer, just check yourself and think, why? Just ask yourself, even if nobody else is asking you, ask yourself, why do I want to say no to this person who wants something? And if your answer to yourself is, I'm afraid that they will, fill in the blank, then maybe try to explore, will they? Because boy, that would have been, I would have, and my coworkers would have gotten awakened a lot less in the night by the chilled water not being the right temperature, and there being like, you know, problems with the water cooled doors, or water into the floor in the machine room. Like, I feel like it would have been, that was a poor choice on my part that I mostly wasn't willing to think about why I was saying no. I was just shutting myself off from the possibility of being open to more collaboration. If that helps at all. Yeah. Oh, it looks like you're waving a hand, but you're just saying, why are we not sorry yet? Yeah. No? All right. I think we're possibly at the part where everyone wants to ask one-on-one questions. So, we're possibly at the part where everyone wants to walk over to a Republican and ask one-on-one questions.
Good.